The warm Los Angeles sun was setting on a quiet Thursday evening when Officer James Keller began his usual patrol route through the city's upscale Beverly Hills neighborhood. Known among his colleagues for his quick temper and controversial history of racial profiling, Keller had already issued several questionable citations that week. His dark blue police cruiser moved slowly along the palm-lined streets, his eyes scanning each passing vehicle with unusual intensity. At exactly 7:15 p.m., a sleek black Bentley Continental GT caught his attention. The luxury car gleamed under the golden California sunset, its windows tinted just within legal limits. Behind the wheel sat none other than Mike Tyson, the legendary boxing champion, dressed sharply in a black suit as he headed to a charity event for underprivileged youth. Keller's eyes narrowed as he watched the Bentley through his rearview mirror. Despite the car's perfect condition and Tyson's careful driving, something stirred in the officer's mind. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel for a moment before he flipped on his cruiser's lights, manufacturing a reason to initiate a stop. The Bentley pulled over smoothly, positioning itself perfectly along the curb. Several passers-by slowed their pace, recognizing both the luxury vehicle and its famous owner. A small crowd began to gather at a respectful distance, their smartphones already recording the scene unfolding before them. Mike Tyson remained calm and collected, his hands visible on the steering wheel, just as he'd learned from years of experiencing such situations. Through his rearview mirror, he watched Officer Keller approach, noting the aggressive stance and hand already resting on his utility belt. Despite his worldwide fame and success, Tyson was no stranger to racial profiling, having faced similar situations throughout his life. License and registration, Keller barked, his tone sharp and hostile before he'd even reached the driver's window. His right hand remained uncomfortably close to his baton, despite Tyson's obvious compliance and peaceful demeanor. "Good evening, officer," Tyson replied politely, his voice steady and controlled. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" His question was legitimate and delivered with respect, but it seemed to agitate Keller further. The gathering crowd had grown larger now, with many recognizing the boxing legend. Whispers spread through the onlookers as they noticed Officer Keller's unnecessarily aggressive stance. Some began live-streaming the interaction, sensing the tension in the air. "Step out of the vehicle," Keller demanded, ignoring Tyson's question entirely. His hand now gripped his baton tightly, knuckles whitening against the black grip. The order was unnecessary and without cause, a fact not lost on the watching crowd. Tyson took a deep breath, maintaining his composure despite the clear prejudice he was facing. He'd spent years working on anger management and personal growth, transforming himself from the explosive fighter of his youth into a more measured, mature individual. These moments tested that growth, but he remained steady. "Officer, I'm actually on my way to a charity event for kids," Tyson explained calmly, reaching slowly for his jacket pocket. "I have the invitation right here, and I'd be happy to show you my license and registration as well." But Keller wasn't interested in explanations or documentation. His prejudices had already taken control of the situation, clouding his judgment and professionalism. The officer's face reddened with each passing second, his anger building without justification. The sun had nearly set now, casting long shadows across the scene as tension continued to mount. The gathered crowd had grown to nearly 30 people, their phones capturing every moment of the increasingly volatile situation. Some had already begun calling the police department to report Keller's behavior, recognizing the dangerous direction the stop was taking. In that moment, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the Hollywood Hills, what should have been a routine traffic stop was about to become a pivotal moment in the ongoing conversation about police reform and racial justice in America. Neither man knew it yet, but their interaction would soon test both Tyson's personal growth and Officer Keller's deeply rooted prejudices in ways that would impact far more than just their own lives. The tension in the air grew thicker as Officer Keller's patience wore thin. The crowd of onlookers had doubled in size, their phones illuminating the darkening street like fireflies. Among them, a local news reporter happened to be passing by, and she quickly began broadcasting the scene live on social media. "I said, step out of the vehicle." Keller shouted again, his voice cracking with barely contained anger. His free hand moved to unlatch the snap on his baton holder, a small clicking sound echoing in the tense silence. Mike Tyson looked at the officer through his side mirror, noting how Keller's body language had become increasingly aggressive. Drawing from years of reading opponents in the ring, Tyson could sense the dangerous mix of fear and prejudice in the officer's stance. Still, he remained determined to handle the situation peacefully. "Officer Keller," Tyson said calmly, having noticed the name tag on the officer's uniform, "I understand you're doing your job. I'm going to step out slowly, but I want to make sure we both feel safe." His voice carried the wisdom of a man who had learned valuable lessons about controlling his emotions through years of personal growth. As Tyson began to open his door, someone from the crowd called out, "That's Mike Tyson. Leave him alone." The shout seemed to startle Officer Keller, whose grip on his baton tightened visibly. The legendary boxer emerged from his Bentley with deliberate slowness, his hands raised slightly to show he carried no threats. Despite standing several inches shorter than Officer Keller, Tyson's powerful presence commanded respect from everyone present. Everyone except the increasingly agitated officer. "Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle," Keller demanded, his voice trembling slightly as he fully unholstered his baton. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, with several people now openly protesting the officer's behavior. Tyson complied with the order, placing his hands on the roof of his car. "Officer," he said steadily, "I have identification in my pocket and registration in the glove compartment. There's also an invitation to tonight's charity event where I'm supposed to speak to kids about making positive choices in life." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on the bystanders. Here was Mike Tyson, once known for his explosive temper, demonstrating remarkable restraint and maturity while facing clear discrimination. Several members of the crowd had begun calling the police department directly, reporting Officer Keller's misconduct. A young woman in the crowd, a social worker named Sarah Chen, stepped forward slightly. "I work at the youth center where Mr. Tyson is speaking tonight," she called out. "He's expected there in 20 minutes. This stop is completely unnecessary." Officer Keller spun toward Sarah, momentarily distracted by her intervention. "Step back," he shouted, waving his baton threateningly in her direction. The crowd gasped collectively at this display of unprofessional behavior. Tyson used this moment to slowly reach for his phone, which was visible in his jacket pocket. "Officer," he said calmly, "I'm going to call the police chief. He's expecting me at the event tonight, and he can verify my identity." The mention of the police chief seemed to push Officer Keller over the edge. Perhaps it was the fear of consequences, or maybe it was the realization that his target was well connected. Whatever the reason, something snapped in the officer's mind. The gathering crowd held its breath as the situation teetered on the edge of explosion. The golden streetlights cast harsh shadows across the scene, highlighting the contrast between Tyson's composed demeanor and Keller's growing instability. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching, likely responses to the multiple calls from concerned citizens. But they were still minutes away, and Officer Keller's grip on his professional conduct was slipping with each passing second. The air crackled with tension as the next few moments would determine whether this situation would end in tragedy or transformation. No one in the crowd could have predicted what was about to happen next, but everyone knew they were witnessing a moment that would soon make headlines across the nation. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Keller's control over the situation, and himself, continued to unravel. The distant sirens grew louder, but they still weren't close enough to prevent what was about to unfold. The crowd of witnesses had grown to nearly 100 people, their phones recording every tense moment. Mike Tyson maintained his position, hands still placed carefully on his car's roof. Despite his past reputation as the most feared boxer in history, he was demonstrating remarkable restraint. His years of personal development and meditation practice were being put to their ultimate test. "I'm reaching for my phone very slowly," Tyson announced clearly, making sure both Officer Keller and the watching crowd could hear his intentions. His hand moved with deliberate caution toward his jacket pocket. But Officer Keller had reached his breaking point. The combination of his own prejudices, the growing crowd, and the realization that he had targeted a celebrity was too much for his fragile ego to handle. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Keep your hands where they are." Sarah Chen, the social worker who had spoken up earlier, tried once more to defuse the situation. "Please, Officer Keller," she called out, her professional training in conflict resolution evident in her tone. "Mr. Tyson is expected at our youth center. The kids are waiting to hear him speak about personal transformation." The mention of transformation seemed to trigger something in Keller's mind. Here was Mike Tyson, once known as the baddest man on the planet, now serving as a mentor to troubled youth. Meanwhile, Keller's own career was littered with complaints about racial profiling and excessive force. "I said be quiet." Keller screamed at Sarah, completely losing his professional composure. His face had turned a deep shade of red, visible even under the streetlights. Sweat began to drip down his forehead despite the cool evening air. Tyson chose this moment to speak again, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had faced his own demons and emerged stronger. "Officer," he said calmly, "I understand what you might be feeling right now. I've been there, letting anger and fear control my actions. But we have a choice in this moment." The gathered crowd fell silent, hanging on every word. Even those who had been shouting in protest moments before stopped to listen. The only sounds were the approaching sirens and the subtle whir of dozens of phone cameras recording. "We can either let this situation define us," Tyson continued, still not moving from his position, "or we can show these people, especially those kids waiting at the center, that change is possible." For a brief moment, something flickered across Officer Keller's face, perhaps recognition, perhaps shame, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by a hardened look of determination. His grip tightened on his baton as he took a step closer to Tyson. A woman in the crowd gasped. Someone shouted, "Don't do it!" The air became electric with anticipation. Everyone present could sense that they were about to witness either a terrible mistake or a remarkable moment of transformation. Tyson remained perfectly still, his breath steady and controlled. His eyes, visible in the reflection of his car's window, showed no fear, only a deep understanding of the pivotal moment they were in. He had been in countless high-pressure situations in the ring, but this was different. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about breaking a cycle of violence and prejudice. The sirens were now just blocks away. Red and blue lights began to flash against the buildings around them, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere. Officer Keller's fellow police officers would arrive any second, but his next action would determine whether they would be preventing a tragedy or witnessing a miracle. In that fraction of a second, as Keller raised his baton and Tyson remained motionless, the entire crowd held its breath. The next few moments would either become another tragic headline about police brutality or a powerful story of restraint, wisdom, and the possibility of change. The sound of the baton cutting through the air broke the evening's tension. In a moment of blind rage, Officer Keller swung the weapon toward Mike Tyson's shoulder. The crowd's collective gasp seemed to freeze time itself as the metal rod descended. The impact made a sickening thud against Tyson's muscular shoulder. Despite his legendary tolerance for pain, developed through years in the boxing ring, Tyson couldn't help but wince. The crowd erupted in shouts of anger and disbelief. Dozens of phones captured the assault in high definition, their lights illuminating the scene like an impromptu stadium. But what happened next would shock everyone present. Instead of retaliating, which everyone, especially Officer Keller, might have expected from the former heavyweight champion, Tyson took one step back, his hand still raised in a peaceful gesture. His face showed pain, but his eyes remained calm and focused. "Officer," Tyson said, his voice steady despite the throbbing in his shoulder, "you just made a choice. Now I'm going to make mine." The words carried no threat, only a profound sense of clarity. Keller, seemingly surprised by both his own action and Tyson's response, stood frozen with the baton still raised. The reality of what he had just done began to sink in as the wailing sirens grew deafening. Red and blue lights now flooded the street as 3 police cruisers rounded the corner. Sarah Chen, the social worker, had already dialed the police chief's direct number, a contact she had from her work at the youth center. "Chief Martinez," she spoke urgently into her phone, "Officer Keller just struck Mike Tyson with his baton at the corner of Wilshire and Beverly. Mr. Tyson was on his way to speak at our center. Please hurry." The arriving officers quickly assessed the scene. Among them was Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, known in the community for her fair approach and dedication to police reform. She immediately recognized both Tyson and Keller, and her experienced eyes took in the situation in seconds. "Officer Keller," Rodriguez called out firmly, "lower your weapon and step back immediately." Her hand rested on her own holster, not out of threat but precaution. Keller's arm trembled as he slowly lowered the baton. The weight of his actions seemed to physically press down on his shoulders as he took several unsteady steps backward. His face had lost all color, replaced by a sickly pallor as reality set in. Tyson, still maintaining his remarkable composure, finally lowered his hands and turned to face the officers. A small trickle of blood had started to seep through his expensive suit jacket where the baton had struck. Several people in the crowd called out, offering to be witnesses to the unprovoked assault. Sergeant Rodriguez approached Tyson first. "Mr. Tyson, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" Her voice carried genuine concern and professional courtesy. "I'm fine, Sergeant," Tyson replied, his voice carrying no hint of anger. "But I think Officer Keller and I need to have a conversation, not as a boxer and a cop, but as two men who both know what it's like to let anger control their actions." The crowd fell silent again, struck by the wisdom and forgiveness in Tyson's words. Even some of the officers present exchanged surprised looks. This was not the outcome anyone had expected when the situation began escalating. In the distance, another vehicle approached. This one unmarked but moving with clear purpose. Chief Martinez had arrived personally, having recognized the significance of the situation as soon as he received Sarah's call. As the chief's car pulled up, Tyson reached inside his jacket and finally retrieved his phone. On its screen was the prepared speech he had planned to give at the youth center that evening. Its title read, "Transforming Anger into Understanding, A Journey of Change." The irony of the moment was lost on no one. What had started as a racially motivated traffic stop was about to become something entirely different. A lesson in redemption that neither man had planned to teach that evening. Chief Martinez's arrival brought a new energy to the tense scene. His reputation for fairness and commitment to community policing was well known throughout Los Angeles. As he stepped out of his unmarked car, his expression was grave but composed, taking in every detail of the situation before him. The growing crowd had their phones trained on the unfolding drama, live streaming to thousands of viewers across social media platforms. But instead of the violent confrontation many might have expected, they were witnessing something remarkable. "Mr. Tyson," Chief Martinez said, approaching the former champion with respect, "I just watched several videos of what happened here. Do you want to press charges?" His question hung in the air as everyone waited for Tyson's response. Mike Tyson touched his injured shoulder, the blood now forming a visible stain on his jacket. A paramedic who had arrived with the police stood nearby, waiting to examine the injury. But Tyson's mind seemed to be elsewhere. "Chief," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet street, "I had a speech prepared for those kids tonight. It was about how I learned to handle my anger, how I discovered that real strength isn't about hurting people, it's about having the power to hurt someone but choosing not to." Officer Keller, now disarmed and standing between two fellow officers, visibly flinched at these words. His face showed a mix of shame, fear, and something else, perhaps the first glimmer of understanding. Instead of pressing charges, Tyson continued, "I have a different proposal." He looked directly at Keller for the first time since the assault. "I want Officer Keller to come with me to the youth center. Not tonight, but once things calm down, I want him to be part of the conversation about change." Sarah Chen stepped forward, her phone still recording the interaction. "The kids at our center," she added, "they deal with anger and prejudice every day. Maybe they need to hear both sides of this story, not just about transformation, but about what happens when we let our fears control us." Chief Martinez nodded slowly, understanding the significance of what was being offered. "Officer Keller," he said firmly, "you'll be suspended pending a full investigation. But Mr. Tyson is offering you something rare, a chance to turn this mistake into a lesson." The paramedic finally got his chance to examine Tyson's shoulder, cutting away part of the expensive suit jacket. The injury, while painful, wasn't severe, though it would certainly leave a bruise. As the medic worked, Tyson continued speaking, his words carrying the weight of personal experience. "I spent years of my life letting anger control me," he said, his voice carrying to everyone present. "I hurt people, I lost control. But I also learned that it's never too late to change. The hardest punch I ever threw wasn't in the ring. It was at my own anger, knocking it down before it could control me again." Several officers in the crowd nodded, recognizing the truth in his words. Even some of those who had been shouting angrily at Keller minutes before fell silent, absorbing the unexpected turn of events. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been coordinating with other officers to manage the scene, approached Chief Martinez with a tablet. On it played several viral videos of the incident, already generating thousands of comments and shares. The story was spreading rapidly across the internet. This could be a watershed moment, the chief said quietly to Tyson, not just for Officer Keller or the department, but for how we handle these situations nationwide. Are you sure this is how you want to proceed? Tyson looked at the growing number of news vans arriving at the scene, then at Officer Keller's defeated posture, and finally at his own reflection in his car's window. The man looking back at him wasn't the same person who had once lost control in the ring. He was someone who had learned the true meaning of strength. I'm sure, Tyson replied firmly. Sometimes the best way to fight hate is to show people a better path. Those kids are waiting to hear a story about transformation. Now they'll get an even better one than I planned. The next morning, Mike Tyson's decision made headlines across the country. News channels played the video footage on repeat, but not for the reason many expected. Instead of another tragic story about police violence, they were covering something unprecedented. A story of forgiveness and potential redemption. Inside the police department's conference room, Chief Martinez sat across from Officer Keller, who looked like he hadn't slept all night. His police badge and gun lay on the table between them, surrendered as part of his suspension. Do you understand the gravity of what happened last night? Chief Martinez asked, his voice stern but not unkind. And do you understand the gift you've been given? Keller nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on his badge. The events of the previous night played over and over in his mind, his anger, his fear, his complete loss of control. But most of all, he remembered Tyson's unexpected response to his violence. Meanwhile, at the youth center, Sarah Chen was managing a flood of media requests. The center's small office had become an impromptu command center, with phones ringing constantly. News vans lined the street outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of Mike Tyson when he arrived. Tyson walked into the youth center at exactly 9 a.m., his injured shoulder wrapped in bandages beneath a fresh suit. The bruise had darkened overnight, but his spirit seemed lighter than ever. The kids who had missed his speech the night before rushed to greet him, having seen the viral videos of the incident. Mr. Tyson, one teenage boy asked, his voice shaking slightly, "Why didn't you hit him back?" "You could have." The question hung in the air as other kids gathered around, all wondering the same thing. Tyson smiled, seeing an opportunity to share the lesson he had learned through years of personal struggle. "Let me tell you about two different kinds of strength," he began, gesturing for the kids to sit down. "There's the strength to hit someone, and then there's the strength to stop yourself from hitting back. Which one do you think is harder?" Across town, Officer Keller was being interviewed by Internal Affairs. But rather than being defensive or making excuses, he was doing something unexpected. He was telling the truth about his prejudices, his fears, and his need to change. "I saw Mike Tyson's car and made assumptions," he admitted, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I let my prejudices control my actions. But what happened next?" His response, "It showed me something I never understood before." The Internal Affairs investigators exchanged glances. They were used to officers defending their actions or demanding union representation. Keller's honesty was something new. Back at the youth center, Tyson was working with Sarah to develop a new program, one that would bring police officers and young people together to talk about anger, fear, and the possibility of change. The incident that could have ended in tragedy was being transformed into something positive. "We're calling it Strength Through Peace," Sarah explained to a group of reporters. "Mr. Tyson and Officer Keller will both share their stories. It's about understanding that real power isn't about domination. It's about transformation." The news spread quickly through social media. Hashtag Strength Through Peace began trending, with people sharing their own stories of choosing peace over violence, forgiveness over revenge. By afternoon, Chief Martinez had made his decision about Officer Keller's future. Instead of immediate termination, you would be required to undergo extensive racial sensitivity training, counseling, and, most importantly, participate in the new Youth Center program. "This isn't about letting anyone off easy," the chief explained to his command staff. "This is about turning a moment of failure into an opportunity for real change, both for Officer Keller and for our entire department." As the sun set on that second day, Tyson sat alone in his home office, reading messages of support from around the world. His shoulders still ached from the Baton strike, but he smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest victories happen outside the ring, in moments when we choose wisdom over wrath, peace over power. 1 month after the incident, the youth center's main hall was packed with an unusual mix of people. Teenagers from the neighborhood sat alongside police officers in uniform, all waiting for the first session of the Strength Through Peace program to begin. The tension in the room was visible, but so was the hope. Mike Tyson stood at the front of the room, his shoulder fully healed, but the memory of that night still fresh in his mind. Beside him, looking nervous but determined, stood Officer James Keller. The past month had changed him visibly. His stance was less rigid, his eyes more open and aware. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Tyson began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Some of you might be wondering why I'm standing next to the officer who struck me. Others might be wondering why he isn't in jail. The answer is simple, because sometimes the hardest fights aren't won with fists." The teenagers in the room shifted in their seats, many of them recording the session on their phones. They had all seen the viral videos of the incident, but this was different. This was about what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. Officer Keller stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he took the microphone. The past month had been challenging: intensive racial sensitivity training, counseling sessions, and the constant knowledge that his career and reputation hung by a thread. 4 weeks ago, Keller began, his voice shaky but sincere, "I let fear and prejudice control my actions. I saw Mr. Tyson's car and made assumptions. I saw his face and let my biases take over. I had a choice that night, and I made the wrong one." Several other police officers in the room nodded, recognizing their own potential for similar mistakes. The teenagers watched intently, many of them having faced similar prejudices in their own encounters with law enforcement. Sarah Chen, who had helped organize the program, stood at the back of the room with Chief Martinez. They watched as Tyson and Keller took turns sharing their stories, Tyson speaking about his own journey from anger to peace, and Keller openly discussing his struggles with bias and fear. "The hardest thing," Keller continued, "wasn't facing punishment or public shame. It was facing myself in the mirror and admitting that I needed to change. Mr. Tyson could have pressed charges. He could have ended my career. Instead, he showed me what real strength looks like." One of the teenagers raised his hand. "But how do we know you're really changing? How do we know this isn't just for show?" The question was direct, reflecting the skepticism many felt. Keller looked at Tyson, who nodded encouragingly. "You're right to question me," Keller replied. "Words are easy. That's why I'm here every week, not just today. That's why I'm working with community leaders, learning about my biases, and trying to become a better officer and a better person." The program had already gained national attention. Other police departments were reaching out, wanting to implement similar initiatives. News crews often waited outside, hoping to document this unusual partnership between a former boxing champion and the officer who had assaulted him. "Change isn't about one moment," Tyson explained to the group. "It's about the choices we make every day. Officer Keller made a bad choice that night, but now he's making better ones. And that's what this program is about, learning to make better choices, whether you're a kid from the neighborhood or an officer with a badge." As the session continued, something remarkable began to happen. The invisible barrier between the officers and the teenagers started to fade. Questions became more honest, responses more genuine. Both sides began to see each other as people, not just uniforms or stereotypes. By the end of the evening, plans were already being made for the next session. Some of the teens had volunteered to share their own stories, and several officers had signed up to be regular participants. What had started as a response to a violent incident was growing into something much more meaningful, a real bridge between law enforcement and the community they served. 6 months after the fateful night of the traffic stop, Mike Tyson and Officer James Keller stood together on a much bigger stage. They had been invited to speak at the National Police Academy's annual conference about the success of their Strength Through Peace program, which had now spread to 30 other cities across the country. The auditorium was filled with police officers, community leaders, and media representatives from around the world. The viral video of their confrontation played on the large screen behind them, but now it served a different purpose, as a teaching tool rather than a source of outrage. Looking at this video now, Keller said to the audience, his voice steady and confident, "I barely recognize myself. That man was full of fear, prejudice, and anger. He saw a black man in an expensive car and immediately assumed the worst. He saw Mike Tyson and only remembered old headlines about violence. Tyson stood beside him, nodding supportively. The former champion had become more than just a partner in the program. He had become a friend and mentor to Keller over the past months. Their unlikely partnership had transformed both men in ways neither could have predicted. But what you don't see in this video, Keller continued, is what happened after. You don't see how one man's choice to respond to hatred with wisdom changed not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of young people in our community. The presentation included statistics that impressed even the most skeptical observers. In the 6 months since the program began, complaints against police in their district had dropped by 40%. More importantly, trust between local youth and law enforcement had improved significantly, with many teenagers now considering careers in community policing. Sarah Chen, who had been promoted to Director of Community Relations at the Youth Center, shared her own observations. What started as a response to a crisis has become a model for real change, she explained. We're not just talking about building bridges, we're actually doing it, one conversation at a time. Back in Los Angeles, the original youth center had become a symbol of possibility. The walls that were once covered in graffiti now displayed artwork created jointly by police officers and local teenagers. The parking lot where Tyson and Keller had their confrontation had been transformed into a community garden tended by officers and young people working side by side. Chief Martinez, who had taken a risk by supporting the program instead of simply firing Keller, shared the department's new training protocols. We've learned that real strength isn't about power over others, he said. It's about the power to change ourselves and help others change too. As Tyson stepped up to the microphone, the audience fell silent. His words carried the weight of someone who had lived through both sides of the story, the anger that could destroy and the wisdom that could heal. 6 months ago, Officer Keller hit me with his baton. Tyson began, drawing nervous laughter from the crowd. But the real impact wasn't physical. That moment could have added to the cycle of violence and revenge. Instead, it became a beginning, the start of something that's changing lives across the country. The evidence of that change was visible in the back of the auditorium, where a group of teenagers from the original youth center sat alongside their local police officers. They had flown in specially to support their mentors and share their experiences with the program. As the presentation concluded, Tyson and Keller unveiled their plans for the future, a nationwide initiative to implement similar programs in every major city. The funding had already been secured, supported by both police departments and community organizations who had seen the program's success. The story didn't end that night on the street, Keller said in his closing remarks. It began there, and it continues every time someone chooses understanding over anger, growth over revenge, and peace over power. That's the real strength Mr. Tyson taught me, and that's the lesson we're sharing with the world. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for the two men on stage. It was for the possibility they represented. A possibility that even the darkest moments could be transformed into opportunities for growth, understanding, and lasting change.